Before the Ukraine invasion and post the COVID-19 pandemic, there were good reasons to believe that major powers including the United States, China, India, Japan, Russia and the leading European states would put aside their growing geopolitical rivalry to manage shared global threats, and that this cooperation would create a ballast against otherwise escalating tensions. Well, 1 year into the Russian special operation, and this view that spheres of influence are a thing of the past is more widely held than ever. The first major war on European soil since World War II is seen by many American and foreign policy elites, paradoxically, not as a sign that realities of rivalry in the international power politics are back, but rather that Western values and security cooperation can triumph over them. According to many American critics, US President Joe Biden's approach to the conflict has been his greatest foreign policy success, and a definite indication that American foreign policy is heading in the right direction. In fact, the national security strategy that the White House unveiled in October all but performed a victory lap, noting that we are leading a united, principled and resolute response to Russia's invasion, and that the US has rallied the world to support the Ukraine people as they bravely defend their country. But when you pull back from this zealotry, the image becomes less clear. While not quite a deterrence failure for the United States, the war in Ukraine is at least a glaring failure of American policy choices over the past few decades to keep peace in Europe. Indeed, the war has demonstrated the West's resolve to face the resurgence of power politics. Yet, it has also demonstrated the practical limits of such approach. As some have claimed, the last year has not been a demonstration of a world of rivalry, great power conflict or spheres of influence, but rather a rebuttal of these ideas. It demonstrates that the US cannot always dissuade a determinedly revisionist regime without incurring intolerable large costs and risks. The incorrect diagnosis is significant because it increases the likelihood of similar errors reoccurring. Many Western commentators have believed for the past year that the war in Ukraine represents a geopolitical turning point, uniting not only the United States and NATO allies, but also a larger liberal coalition to oppose Russian aggression. According to this perspective, nations from all over the world ought to naturally assist in the West in this crucial conflict between democracy and tyranny. Furthermore, several dozen nations refrain from voting on resolutions denouncing Russia at the UN General Assembly and in the Human Rights Council, including major democracies in India, Indonesia, South Africa, as well as numerous other nations in Africa. As the war has progressed, several of these countries have attempted to retain contacts with Russia as well as the West, despite many of them being unwilling to legally embrace the West's economic sanctions. All the while, democratic leaders of the West are looking at these smaller states to effectively choose sides. Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, stated that, quote, "Russia's war marks a new reality. It requires each and every one of us to take a firm and responsible decision and to take a side." From the perspective of the world's liberal democracy, the Russia's invasions of Ukraine is a wake-up call to defend the principles of the liberal, rule-based international order. After the end of the Cold War, they believed that the liberal vision, based on the triad of human rights, liberal democracy and market economy, have triumphed and would conquer the whole globe over time. But despite its undeniable achievements, key elements of the liberal vision have lost both domestic and international support. One of the few things that world leaders can agree on is that the world is entering a decisive decade. President Putin on October in 2022 stated that, quote, "The world is at a crossroad and that we are in for probably the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time most important decade since the end of World War II. Leaders have tried to frame this contest for the international order using different dichotomies: democracies versus autocracies, rich versus poor, West versus the rest, or those that support the rule-based order versus those that do not. Still, looking at the big picture, the systemic competition between liberal democratic and autocratic visions and their respective proponents has become increasingly central in the contest for international order. While the revisionists have tried to describe the ongoing struggle as a competition between the West and the rest, even respondents in China, Brazil, India and South Africa do not see the major geopolitical fault line today. Instead, many democratic leaders have described the current struggle as a competition between democracies and autocracies. Ultimately, learning the right lessons from Ukraine is especially important as the United States enters a period of escalation conflict over the Western sphere of influence boundaries, and how those boundaries will intersect with those of Russia and China. This analysis will look to highlight the return of great power politics and what the war in Ukraine has revealed about geopolitical rivalry. So let's first look at the foreign policy failure and how inflexible policies persuaded by US policymakers in Eastern Europe have directly contributed to the run-up to the war. Secondly, we will look to why spheres of influence are back and quickly look into the Russian-China autocratic vision. This is Zero Foxtrot, and on this channel we look to break down the biased narratives spun by governments and mainstream media, and instead provide you with transparency and truth. If this is your first time on this channel, I welcome you. Let's begin. US President Joe Biden, who arrived in a surprise visit to Kiev last week, reaffirmed America's unwavering commitment to Ukraine's democracy, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And with this repetitious pitch, it is imperative to highlight the mismatch between the administration's statement before Russia's invasion and the White House's response afterwards. US officials, for instance, made the exact same statement to Ukraine in December 2021. Meanwhile, US officials contemplated deploying US military advisors to help the Ukrainians. Nevertheless, by February 24, 2022,
мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Призываю вас немедленно сложить оружие и идти домой.
The administration's tone had changed drastically. The US would not directly intervene in the conflict in Ukraine. The US would respond passively, taking part in the conflict through aid, sanctions, and intelligence support. This was without a doubt the right decision. A fatal error would be for the United States to directly engage in a conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia. Yet it raised concerns about the administration's approach to averting the war in the months beforehand. According to all accounts, Biden had decided weeks or even months before the invasion that it would be too expensive to engage Russia directly. Administration officials openly discussed equipping a future insurgency in Ukraine after a widely anticipated Russian triumph. This immediately raises questions. If they knew all along that the odds of preventing conflict were slim and that the United States would not directly engage, why did they not consider other policy options, such as offering a freeze or suspension on admitting Ukraine to NATO? Why continue to play such an exceptionally poor hand in the hope that it would deter Russian action? One explanation is that they didn't want to accept what an outright declaration that the United States wouldn't defend Ukraine would mean about American strength, more generally during a time of escalating rivalry. The Biden administration cannot be solely held responsible for this cognitive dissonance. From at least the George W. Bush administration, even if many other member states rejected the concept, the United States had assumed that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually join NATO, and that to take any other action would be to accept constraints on American power. In fact, it is widely acknowledged by foreign policy elites that NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia was more aspirational than practical, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Saying that Ukraine won't join NATO soon, if at all, is an admission of reality rather than a concession to Putin. Nevertheless, US politicians were unable to embrace the truth even as conflict neared. Alternatively, the ability to bleed an adversary across the globe and not close to your own country would definitely suit the US strategic interests. This quite obviously comes at the cost of the Ukrainians, who are being persuaded by the West to continue the fight. Not to mention the ability to observe an adversary's tactics throughout the conflict, and in this respect, the US has been immensely successful. It is impossible to say whether making a concession over Ukraine's eventual NATO membership would have stopped the war. Many Ukrainians would have been less likely to accept Russian demands than Ukraine staying non-aligned, which may have prevented deeper relations to the EU. Some have argued that President Putin's irrational revolutionist and imperialist tendencies caused the war to break out. His rhetoric frequently conveys the idea that he sees Ukraine less as a nation and more of a rebellious Russian colony. He might have decided to take a chance anyhow, valuing possible territorial gains more highly than Western political acquiescence. To claim that the rigid policies implemented by the US had no influence at all on the events leading up to the war would need a remarkably narrow understanding of the geography. The inability to consider any other option for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, or other nations led to a poisonous brew of political tensions, security concerns, and imperialist aspirations that in the end pushed the area to the verge of war. Whatever the final result of this war, the fact that it even took place is a cataclysmic failure of foreign policy. The renewal of great power competition resurfaced in the Trump administration's national security strategy in 2017, which sparked a discussion about the term's definition in Washington. Few people believed that it would imply a return to open hostilities on Europe's periphery, but the conflict in Ukraine is bringing to light the potential costs of mismanaged great power competition and illustrates the potential for disaster if American officials are unable to get over the unipolar outlook. The conflict in Ukraine represents a resurgence of competition over political spheres of influence in a more general geopolitical sense. A sphere of influence at its most basic is a region where a great power can impact political or economic results, while attempting to prevent competing governments from doing the same. The United States simply did not need to worry much about the issue of spheres of influence during the unipolar period of US global dominance that followed post the fall of the Soviet Union, simply because its power was unchallenged. Graham Allison, a political scientist, stated it succinctly, not because the term has become obsolete, but because the entire world has become a de facto American sphere. As a result, the United States was able to largely dismiss Russia's claim that the former Yugoslavia fell under a sphere of influence during NATO's Kosovo operation in 1999. Moscow even went so far as to send Russian paratroopers on a disastrous mission to seize Pristina's airport. It was evident that Russia lacked the capability to back up its claims because its paratroopers were obliged to beg the NATO counterparts for food and supplies. The United States simply responded to China's saber-rattling with Taiwan in the middle of the 1990s with a demonstration of military power, sending a carrier group through the Taiwan Strait to deter Chinese authorities. Washington's demand that spheres of influence should not exist in recent decades was as much of a statement of its own global dominance as anything else. But now, as China and Russia become more capable of defending their own interests in the region closest to their borders, the globe is entering a moment of debate over the boundaries of American dominance. In a world of global power projection, however, nations within the US spheres of influence need not even be in the Western Hemisphere. Since the Second World War, the US has extended its sphere of influence to include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, South Korea, Japan, and arguably Taiwan. So why did the US start claiming to be opposed to sphere of influence? Well, a big reason was that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US began to aspire to folding the entire world into Washington's sphere of influence. This naturally means that any other sphere of influence is illegitimate. So in the minds of Washington advocates of global US hegemony, the old notion of multipolar spheres of influence was replaced by a global world order dominated by Washington. Beijing and Moscow argue that the current world order is characterized by an American attempt to impose Western ideas about democracy and human rights in other countries, if necessary through military intervention. The new world order that the Russia and China are demanding would instead be based on distinct spheres of influence. The crisis over Ukraine is a struggle over the future world order because it turns on precisely these issues. For Putin, Ukraine is culturally and politically part of Russia's sphere of influence. Russia's security needs should give it the right to veto any Ukraine desire to join NATO. Moscow also demands to act as the protector of Russian speakers. For the US, these demands violate some basic principles of the current world order, in particular, the right to independent country to define its own foreign policy and strategic choices. The Ukraine crisis is also about world order because it has clear global implications. The US knows that if Russia attacks Ukraine and establishes its own sphere of influence, a precedent will be set for China. During the Xi era, China has built military bases all over the contested areas of the South China Sea. Beijing's threat to invade Taiwan, a self-governing democratic island that China regards as a rebel province, have also become more overt and frequent. If Putin succeeds in invading Ukraine, the temptation for Xi to attack Taiwan will rise. Russia and China clearly have similar complaints about the current world order. There are some important differences between the approaches of both Moscow and Beijing. Russia is currently more willing to take military risks than China, but its ultimate goal may be more limited. For the Russians, the use of military force in Syria, Ukraine and elsewhere is a way of rejecting the claim made by former US President Barack Obama that Russia is no more than a regional power. But while Russia aspires to be one of the world great powers, China seems to be contemplating displacing the US as a world preeminent power. The difference in the scale of the ambitions of China and Russia reflect the difference in their economic potential. Russia's economy is now roughly the size of Italy's. Moscow simply does not have the wealth to sustain a bid for global supremacy. By contrast, China is now, by some measures, the world's largest economy. It is also the world's largest manufacturer and exporter. Its population of 1.4 billion people is roughly 10 times that of Russia, and as a result, it is realistic for China to aspire to be the most powerful country in the world. But while the differences in the economic potential of Russia and China make Xi ultimately more ambitious than Putin, in the short term, it also makes him more cautious. There is something of the gambler's desperation in Putin's willingness to use military force to try to change the balance of power in Europe. In Beijing, by contrast, there is a strong feeling that time and history are on China's side. The Chinese have also many economic instruments for expanding their influence that are simply not available to the Russians. A signature project of Xi's years is the Belt and Road Initiative, a vast international program of Chinese-funded infrastructure that stretches into Central Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. As America has become significantly more protectionist, China has also used its trading power to expand its global influence. This month has seen the launch of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a vast new free trade area in the Asia Pacific that includes China and several American strategic allies such as Japan and Australia. Granting or withholding access to the Chinese market gives Beijing a tool of influence that is simply not available to Moscow. But will gradualism work? Or do Russia and Chinese need some kind of dramatic moment to create the new world order they seek? History suggests that new governing systems for the world generally emerge after some kind of seismic political event, such as a major war. Furthermore, Russia and China don't seem inclined to sit back and possibly wait for Trump to return to the White House. They know that even Trump's Republican Party includes many hawks intent on confrontation with both China and Russia. In any case, a great deal can happen between now and the next presidential election in November 2024. Russia's impatience is clear, from Putin's willingness to force a crisis over Ukraine. The prospects for a new world order that is more congenial to Russia may depend on whether his Ukrainian gamble works. But even if Putin fails to achieve his goals in Ukraine, the threat to the US-led world order will not disappear. A rising China, led by an ambitious President Xi, will make sure of that. Well, that wraps up the video. If you enjoyed the content, perhaps think about liking and subscribing. It all helps out and motivates me to release more content. I'd also love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Have we entered a bipolar world order where the US no longer holds supremacy? And what are your thoughts on the Russia-China strategic relationships? And more importantly, did the US foreign policy really force these powers to align? Like always, stay safe, stay informed. This is Zero Fox, out.